Good afternoon, Colonel. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good.
Trying to throw SR his co-host, but there he goes. All right. Holy shit. Um, you guys, I have a couple of things that we need to start off the show with. Go ahead and mute your mic if you wouldn't mind, Bridget. Um, this book that King Khan and Ash are doing on Badlands about this Ralph Paluzzo and this CIA Burnson guy. This is literally the stupidest book I've ever read in my life. I can't tell you how stupid it is. Obviously, I don't want to give away their show, but it's the stupidest book I've ever read. I just have to read this to you since we've already covered Venezuela. You guys will appreciate this. This is actually in the book in black and white, talking about Chavez's past. It says that the reason he did whatever they're accusing him of is because all of his brothers and sisters had blonde hair and blue eyes. So Chavez was the only sibling that had dark curly hair and dark skin, saying that his mother had an affair with a black man and produced Hugo Chavez. Now, I'm going to show you guys on Rumble. This is a picture of Hugo Chavez and his siblings. Every single one of them has brown eyes and brown hair. And that's just one of many of this entire book's outrageous, bold face lies that is over the top, like Looney Tunes. Not to mention the fact that they have spelling errors, they have grammatical errors, they have it's literally something that was obviously thrown together at the last minute, and it's mind-boggling how retarded it is. Mind-boggling. All right. Holy crap. Where do we go from here? All right. And at the end of the show, I did get a response from Emmer's watchdog that I want to read to you. But we'll close the show with that. All right. We're on chapter 22. Where are we now? It starts off with the fact that in the early hours of September 1990, undercover agents from the Arizona Department of Public Safety and Phoenix Police swooped down on a ranch-styled house. They had gotten an anonymous tip that a large Las Vegas-style gambling operation was being conducted in the house. And the officer said after the raid that the operation was the biggest full-scale private gambling set up in the Valley of the Sun. Approximately $50,000 a night was being waged by about 15 people to play cards and dice. The proprietor of the establishment, who was leasing the $3 million house for $2,500 a month and was booked into Maricopa County Jail on suspicion of promoting gambling, was none other than Robert Corson. Also arrested were his wife/ex-wife. Corson told the police they were technically divorced. Randy was her name, and 5 others helping them run the gaming tables. Also, BJ Corson's mother, BJ Corson's mother, whose name was on the lease. She was nowhere to be found the night of the raid. Corson had come to Phoenix from Houston by way of La Costa in California. In 1988, the Federal Home Loan Bank had removed him from Vision Bank savings and prohibited him from ever participating in banking institutions. This so-called removal and prohibition order on Corson was never made public. However, a year later, the same order was issued against B.J. Garman, his mother, the first such order made public under the Financial Institution Reform, Recovery, and Enforcement Act of 1989. The order prohibited Garman from ever again participating in any federally insured financial institution. The press release on Garman's prohibition, issued by the Office of Thrift Supervision, stated, quote, examiners discovered a number of large speculative loans that were tainted with conflicts of interest and other violations of law and regulation. Further investigation by OTS, the Office of Thrift, revealed that Vision Bank insiders were receiving financial benefit from loans made by the bank that resulted in substantial loss to the thrift. Extraordinary loan commissions were being paid to a firm associated with Vision Bank insiders, which in turn paid a substantial amount of those commissions to the insiders. Insiders had also arranged to have proceeds of significant dollar amount loans made by Vision Bank diverted through the borrowers and others back to themselves. When, unquote, when federal prosecutors in Houston were questioned about these allegations, they acknowledged that there were two active investigations of Corson, which involved federal agents in Philadelphia and Florida. These were obviously the investigations of the Florida land deal with the St. Joe Paper Company and Hill Financial Savings. By the summer of 91, there were supposedly sealed indictments issued in Pensacola as part of their investigations. Finally, Corson, his mother, and partner Robert Ferguson were indicted in late 1991 in Houston for the Florida land deal. Atkinson, his attorney, Robert Collins, and several others were also indicted in Florida and then convicted. Lawrence Freeman was given immunity from prosecution to testify against Atkinson and his partners, but during the testimony appeared to suffer from memory loss. At the time this book went to press, Corson and his mother had not gone to trial. Before the indictments in March of 1989, both Vision Bank Savings and Hill Financial had been taken over by federal regulators. Hill Financial had suffered an estimated $2 billion in losses. The feds could not find a buyer for Vision and eventually closed the institution in December of 1990, paying off almost $88 million in insured deposits. The Resolution Trust Corporation estimated that the closing of Vision Bank cost taxpayers almost $64 million. After Corson had been banned from the industry in 88, he and his wife and his mother moved to Southern California. They had at least 2 houses in La Costa and a third close by. Allegedly, they also set up a real estate business in La Jolla, along with, although there is nothing on public record in the San Diego County indicating any activity by the three. Then in the summer of 90, they moved to Phoenix and leased the $3 million home in Paradise Valley from an absentee landlord living where? In El Salvador. When Phoenix law enforcement officers raided the house, they found a great deal of opulence inside. Corson probably had 30 pairs of custom-made cowboy boots with exotic skin, the stuff that's illegal to buy in the United States. Well, my husband has quite a few cowboy boots, but they're all legally bought. 20 to 30 custom-made suits and multiple Rolex watches. While he was running the gambling operation, Robert Corson was also dealing in art and jewelry, another favorite money laundering activity of the CIA. After Corson was arrested and booked, he was released on his own recognizance. The original charges against him were dropped as formality, officials said, so that the case could be taken before a grand jury for indictment. However, by the summer of 1991, Corson's case still had not been heard by a grand jury. A couple of weeks after the gambling raid, something far more serious happened to Corson. The IRS paid him a visit, searched his house, and issued a subpoena for him to appear in Houston. Corson may have laughed and scoffed at the efforts of the FBI, but the IRS was no laughing matter. After the IRS arrived, Corson pulled up his Phoenix States and moved. Lieutenant Gonzalez said that Randy told the real estate agent handling the house that Robert had had a heart attack and had returned to Houston. They ended up stiffing the landlord for 2 months of rent. The undercover DPS officers found that Corson had been using marked cards in cheating in his gambling operation. One of the card decks seized in the raid had slight ridges on the card's edge so that an experienced dealer could cheat. Then, sometime in 91, things were apparently getting too hot for Corson, so according to Gonzalez of the Arizona DPS, he skipped the country and fled to Honduras. You know, the Honduras where the CIA has massive operations, that Honduras. An FBI source said Corson had also visited Belize, which doesn't have an extradition treaty with the United States. By the summer of 91, he was back in Phoenix, and after he and his mother were indicted in late 91 for the Florida land deal, the FBI found them in Sedona, Arizona, where BJ was selling jewelry. Meanwhile, the Justice Department had built up a big file on Vision Bank, but it was not receiving any press. Marked on the front of the file were these words: classified. Do not discuss this case with anyone. The law enforcement source said this file had been classified by the CIA. By the middle of the 91, the old warhorse, Walter Michener, was practically out to pasture. His company, the Michener Corporation, was losing money. It no longer owned any land in Cinco Ranch. Michener and his son failed in their attempts to win the horse racing franchise in Houston. Michener never could defeat Houston Mayor Kathy Whitmire. That lack of control may have cost Walt Jr. as well. Houston developer and former savings and loan owner Bob Lanier defeated Whitmire with the help of a $10,000 campaign donation from Michener. In what was an incredible reversal, one of Michener's major lending banks, First City, foreclosed on some Houston property his group owned. This was property just west of downtown that Michener had amassed in his typical fashion, using frontmen so that no one knew what he was doing. He was also counting on the city of Houston to demolish a low-income housing project nearby so that the land would be worth more money. Before that could happen, First City foreclosed. Michener's old financing bank had changed hands. Judge Elkins was probably spinning in his grave when he found out that his bank had foreclosed on Walter Michener, the man who had gotten him his first $1 billion loan. But Michener is not completely down and out. Although he sold Allied Bank to First Interstate of California in 1990, he invested in a little Houston bank called Southwest Bank of Texas, whose growth had skyrocketed, and whose CEO, Walter Johnson, was the former president of Allied Bank. Michener also joined with Jim Elkins, the son of Judge Elkins, to develop a residential area close to downtown with homes starting at $700,000. Their director of sales was Martha Adger, sister of John and Stephen. This is the development that President Bush visited when he walked in the back door and paid a visit to Michener's daughter. Finally, one of the biggest questions in political and business circles in Houston and Greater Texas today is who will be the next Walter Michener. It won't likely be Michener Jr. The son just didn't have the same ruthless instinct that his dad had. Herman Beebe Sr. spent about 10 months in federal prison for copying a plea to bank fraud. His federal tenure began in the country club atmosphere of a penitentiary in Fort Worth, Texas. But he later transferred to Texarkana, a medium security prison, because he allegedly had got into an altercation at Fort Worth. When Beebe was transferred to Texarkana, he may have bumped into his old boss, Carlos Marsalo, who was also incarcerated there. When Beebe got out of jail, he moved into a condo in Destin, Florida, owned by his dentist brother, Elton. He also filed for bankruptcy, but the FDIC has been after him, serving several legal actions against him, alleging fraud and asking that his debts not be discharged. There are even one or two federal regulators who are apparently trying to find out whether Beebe has any money offshore, which I can guarantee you he did. Occasionally, Beebe will be spotted in a restaurant in Dallas where some of his kids live. Mike Atkinson had also moved to Destin and filed for bankruptcy as well. At first, Sanson Financial Consultants, the Isle of Jersey's company, put Atkinson up in a luxurious penthouse. Later, he was reported living in a trailer and restoring 1955 Chevrolets for a living. Atkinson got indicted and convicted for the St. Joe paper deal, but that was his designated role, a fall man, a front man. In turn, the Florida redneck got to live the good life while it lasted. Mario Renda, the hot money broker and mafia associate who knew Khashoggi and several other CIA agents, went to jail for 30 months, but ended up making fools out of the federal authorities. His plea bargain, for which he testified against Martin Swimmer, called for him to pay almost $10 million to the FDIC in restitution. He also agreed to pay the Justice Department $4.25 million in fines, but the FDIC agreed to pay that amount out of the restitution it got from Renda, taking care of their mafia buddies. Unfortunately for taxpayers, the Department of Justice let Renda out of jail before he made restitution, and now the FDIC is left holding the bag, including the $4.25 million that Justice Department wanted. The feds did get Renda to turn over his 101-foot yacht, that he claimed to be worth about $1 million. However, after the FDIC auctioned the boat and paid off the liens against it, they netted $10,000 on the yacht. Take away the cost of the auction, you basically lose money. Neil Bush, the savings and loan poster child, decided he had had enough of Denver, and in the summer of 91 put his house up for sale and moved to Houston. He went to work for a cable TV company and appeared regularly in the gossip columns of the newspapers. After John Connally failed in his 1980 Republican presidential bid, in which Charles Keating was his West Coast finance chairman and briefly managed the campaign in its last dying moments, he joined up with Ben Barnes in a business partnership called Barnes Connally Interest. They went into the commercial real estate development business in Texas, because of course they did. They borrowed money from Keating's Lincoln Savings, Scott Mann's Credit Bank Savings, Don Dixon's Vernon Savings, Jarrett Woods' Western Savings, Delta Savings, Lamar Savings, and United Bank. When Connally filed for bankruptcy in 87, he showed debts of more than $80 million. And he owed that money to 23 savings and loans. Most of those failed. But that didn't stop First Gibraltar Savings from lending him another $600,000 to buy a condominium in Houston in 1989. Conley and Barnes did considerable business with Keating entities. 2 months after Keating purchased Lincoln Savings, one of his subsidiaries bought a little over 3,000 acres west of Austin for $56 million at the urging of Barnes and Conley, who were hired to manage the project and got 50% of the profit for participating. Nothing happened. Lincoln lost millions on the deal and ultimately replaced Barnes and Connolly as the manager. In 1985, Lincoln issued a $20 million line of credit to Chapman Energy and purchased $3 million in stock in that oil company, which was controlled by Barnes and Conley. In addition, Keating's holding company, American Continental Corporation, bought $7 million of stock in American Physician Service Group, where again you find Barnes and Conley on the board of directors. One of the first projects the two former Texas politicians did together was a condo deal in New Mexico, where West Texans go for quarter horse racing. Their partner in the project was a Houston developer, Joe McDermott, the former Mishner employee and close business associate. The group borrowed $12 million from Albuquerque's Federal Savings and Loan, and then the project flopped, with allegations from the New Mexico AG of questionable sales tactics. After Conley declared bankruptcy, he was hired at a huge retainer by his old friends Charles Keating, Oscar Wyatt, and Charles Hurwitz. In August of '87, he was paid $100,000 as a legal retainer by Keating's American Continental Corporation. From '88 to '90, he received $160,000 for consulting for Wyatt's Coastal Corporation. In '88 and '89, he got $250,000 a year for consulting with Hurwitz's Maxim Group. There are also some intelligence connections floating around Conley. Other than just relationships to Michener and Beebe, former Israeli military officer Ari Ben-Beneshi claimed that Conley and other people with strong international political connections were working together in the mid-'80s to procure arms for Iraq, the same country that Conley and Oscar Wyatt visited during the Gulf War. The Israeli operative has also stated that money used to procure arms for Iraq came from American Savings and Loan, including Lincoln. It has been confirmed that Ben Menashe had certain insider knowledge about several notorious savings and loan. In the summer of '91, he stated that in 1988, former Republican Texas Senator John Tower approached the Federal Home Loan Bank Board about the possibility of purchasing Bluebonnet Savings and Loan by Robert Maxwell. Robert Maxwell. The fact that a former Israeli intelligence officer would know in the summer of 1991 any details relating to savings and loan bailout transactions that were part of the Southwest Plan, along with intimate details about fraud and corruption behind the doors of Maxwell's media empire, were questionable. But a lot has happened since that time, and it's now recognized that Maxwell's organization had milked to their last dime, was milked to its last dime prior to his death. And in June of '92, Danny Wall, the former chair of the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, confirmed to Alan Friedman of the Financial Times that Tower had indeed approached him in August of '88 to urge on behalf of Maxwell for a group of 15 failed savings and loan that were sold as a package that was going to be that was under the name Bluebonnet. According to the Israeli operative, video recorded interview with the House of Representative Committee on Foreign Affairs, taped in May of 91, he said he had obtained $56 million in January of 81 from an aide to a Saudi intelligence agent, Kamal Aden. That's the guy that was funding BCCI. But in May of 91, BCCI was still alive and no one was interested in ADEM until it failed like the following year and all the stuff started coming out. Ben Menashe stated that the $56 million consisted of $14 million in cash and $40 million bank drafts drawn on bank worms in Geneva, Switzerland. Ben Menashe further stated that he took $4 million of the funds and placed them in an account at Valley National Bank in Phoenix, Arizona, in the account name of Dr. Earl Bryan, who was earlier discussed because he was involved in the Inslaw promise theft. Prior to Charles Keating's first, and it's weird that you get all of Maxwell being tied up in all of this in relationship to Inslaw, because it was Robert Maxwell that after promise was given to Israel, it was Robert Maxwell who was selling it to all of the governments so that they could track money laundering and find out who was their competitors and hide their own money laundering. Prior to Charles Keating's first issuance of ACC junk bonds through Drexel Burnham, Keating obtained a syndicated loan from Valley National Bank in Phoenix as well. One of the banks participating in the syndication was Saudi European Bank. The small bank in Paris that was involved with Ed Baker, the Houston con man, that allegedly was torched in his Jaguar. He was murdered. In 85, after the issuance of ACC junk bonds, Keating, through an offshore entity controlled by ACC, purchased 15% interest in the Saudi bank's parent company, Saudi European Investment Corp. Sitting on the International Board of Advisors of Saudi European Investment Corp were John Conley, who was representing ACC's interest, Robert A. Anderson, who was the former Secretary of the Navy, who had admitted working with the CIA, was also on that board, along with Fentress Bracewell, a name partner in Robert Clark's law firm. Bracewell and Patterson. Also on the board was Philip Goussard d'Estaing, the brother of a former French president, and S.P. Hinduja, whose family was recently under fire relating to kickbacks from the Swedish arms giant Bofors. You know, there's going to be Sweden in every one of these stories. In July of 92, the Tucson jury awarded ACC bondholders $400 million in damage from this SEIC entity regarding its wrongdoings in concert with the Keating fiasco to avoid regulatory scrutiny of Lincoln. There were also earlier questions raised about big loans, more than $33 million, that Lincoln made to Covenant House. Yes, that Covenant House. The Covenant House that supposedly was a home for runaways that was ran by Father Bruce Ritter. The Covenant House had expanded its programs into Central America, working closely and sharing board members with AmeriCares, a nonprofit organization that supplied quote-unquote humanitarian aid. This was a child trafficking network, guys. And Father Bruce Ritter of the Covenant House was part of it. And this again, was being funded by this nefarious network. And we covered that. It's mentioned in Whitney Webb's book when we did her book. Um, this was part of our whole research into some of the human trafficking pieces of Gladio. And Father Bruce Ritter comes up often. One of Ritter's and Americare's associates in Central America was Roberto Alajos Arzan, a former partner with Nicaraguan dictator Somoza, who obviously worked with the CIA. A board member of both Covenant House and Americares was Robert Macaulay, one of President Bush's closest friends. Imagine my surprise that President Bush would be that close to child trafficking as the former head of the CIA. And I know Illini is going to talk about the Franklin cover up. That's crazy. The two, Robert Macaulay and President Bush, grew up together attending school to include Andover and Yale together. It is not known whether any Lincoln money went to Americares or to Covenant House programs in Central America. Even if it didn't go directly, it would have helped free up other money to be used for those purposes. When Conley ran for Republican presidential nomination in 1980 with the help of Keating, one of his campaign workers was a woman named Joyce Downey. After the campaign failed, Downey went to work for Conley and Barnes. She stated that at one time she was actually living with Ben and Nancy Barnes. After Barnes and Conley went down the tube, Downey moved to Phoenix and became the executive director for the U.S. Council for World Freedom. What is that? Well, that's the American affiliate to the World Anti-Communist League.
Of course.
That was ran by Major General John Singleb, one of the biggest fundraisers and arms procurer for the Contras. Holy shit. These relationships don't prove that any savings and loan money went to the Contras, of course, but they do show the closeness. We've already covered that in George Webb's book. This money definitely went to the Contras. Finally, as proof that we Texans have no memory or no shame, in 1991, the Texas High Rail Speed Authority approved a high-speed rail link between Houston and Dallas to be constructed by a French-American team. This group included Ben Barnes, who functioned as a spokesperson and lobbyist for the group. One of the members of the authority board, which unanimously approved the Barnes group, was none other than John Conley. A good number of people involved in the dirty S&L in Texas and Colorado moved on to greener pastures in Southern California. Not only was this the destination, of course, for Corson and his cousin Roy Daly, it also resulted in Richard Rossmiller, Bill Walters, and E. Trine Starnes relocating there. They had all filed for bankruptcy, yet were living the good life in luxury. They were able to do this by transferring their assets to their wives and children, shielding it from seizure. One of the familiar names who allegedly transferred his assets to trust for his children, according to at least two investigators, was Raymond Hill. Hill said he was forced to sell his father's mansion in River Oaks and move to a more modest abode. He also was reduced to scrapping for court appointments in the county's juvenile courts. He then went on to say, "I'm broke." What he doesn't tell is how much money he transferred to trust for other members of his family. Furthermore, it doesn't appear that the taxpayer servants responsible for recovering S&L money had any curiosity about that either. Carol Kelly, the old Kappa Sigma partner who ran Continental Savings into the ground for Herman Beebe, the mafia guy, got a job with Houston Shoe Hospital, specializing in shoe repair, and later moved to Fort Worth to practice his entrepreneurial skills there. His younger Kappa Sigma friend, George Aubin and John Riddle, continued to hang out in Houston. As for their fraternity Kappa Sigma, in a big story on the University of Texas fraternities in March of 91 in the Texas Monthly, it was not even mentioned as one of the top 6 fraternities there, and was only mentioned a few times in passing in an entire 15-page article. So, the next thing, I'm just going to run through this because this is the last chapter, and it talks about what happened to him. In February of '89, the last story that was done by him and his partner on the mafia connections to the savings and loan scandal was published in the Houston Post about 1 year after the first one appeared. It would not be until a year later, in February of '90, that the first stories on the CIA connections of the scandal were printed, even though they were ready in the fall of '89. In the interim, William Singleton and his partners, who owned the Dallas Times-Herald and the Denver Post, had purchased the Washington Post because they were scared that they were going to continue to write these articles. Quick, somebody buy that and shut this guy up. Singleton was a protege of Houston banker and former Washington Star owner John Albritton. He was also, Joe Albritton was a junk bond and borrowing patron of these scandal-ridden entities. Singleton brought in former Dallas Times-Herald editor Dave Bergen to be the editor at the Houston Post. Bergen, who knew Albritton from his Washington Star days, had previously been the editor of a newspaper in San Francisco and in Orlando, Florida. Bergen was a very smart man and had an unpredictable temper. Bergen usually stood behind me in my investigative work. In particular, when I was writing about the huge, powerful Methodist hospital in Houston. However, one time he threatened to fire one of the Houston Post best reporters if she did not change a story to remove something negative about one of their advertisers. Bergen initially liked the CIA stories. It is doubtful that any of the stories would have seen the light of day without his presence and support. However, Bergen wanted to run the stories one at a time, one every week. He claimed he wanted to see what the reaction was. Look for congressional responses. Bergen's decision to simply dribble the stories out was a major tactical error because the material would have had way more impact if it had ran as a series. Not only did Congress not want to investigate any part of this S&L crisis, they weren't about to take on the CIA either. They had seen what had happened to congressional critics of the CIA, like Senator Frank Church and, of course, Leo Ryan. The first 2 stories that appeared in the Houston Post were too weak to stand by themselves. They were designed as an introduction to a longer series. As a result of our just running those 2 by themselves with no immediate follow-up, many journalists around the country had already made up their minds after reading the 2 stories. There wasn't much to the story. Bergen had been the city editor of the Washington Star during Watergate, and of course he had gotten his butt beaten badly by the Washington Post. At one time, he told me that he had even been Washington Post Washington reporter Carl Bernstein's roommate. As a result, he had always considered the Washington Post coverage of Watergate to be investigative reporting, which of course we know it wasn't. Nevertheless, I believe the real reason the stories were delayed and published sporadically by the editors was they were afraid to run everything we had at once. They wanted to stick their little toe in the water to see if anybody bit it off. The most significant and interesting information we had unearthed, the story of Walter Mitchner and his connections to many of the major players in the SNL scandal, never appeared in the Post. The reason they didn't, and the reason the stories were originally delayed for months, had to do with our newspaper's law firm, Fulbright and Jaworski. They were connected to Walter Mitchner. Although the stories about the CIA and savings and loan were dribbled out in the Post over a period of about 9 months in 90, most of the information had been pulled together by the fall of 89. It had been sent over to Fulbright and Jaworski for comment. The Post Maine's attorney was Rufus Wallingford. When Wallingford called back after reading the stories, his first and main objection to writing anything about Walter Mitchner was his claim that Mitchner was not a public figure, which is ridiculous in Houston. What Wallingford said about Mitchner not being a public figure was absurd, and everyone in the city desk hooted when they heard it. Mitchner was probably the most powerful man in Houston and possibly Texas. He had been appointed to various state agencies by many governors. He was the chairman and largest stockholder of the third largest bank in Houston, and he was named in the Texas Monthly as one of the most powerful Texans multiple times. He was also called a kingmaker. There's no doubt that he was a public figure. There was obviously something else going on with Wallingford other than merely his interpretation of what constituted a public figure. Several days later, assistant editor Tim Graham, who was editing the CIA stories, and I went to Fulbright and Jaworski's offices to meet with Tom Godbold, an associate attorney that worked for Wallingford. He was instantly started to criticize and vehemently attack our stories on Mitchner, and he did so in language obviously intended to give us the impression that his law firm believed we were libeling Mitchner and that the paper would get sued and possibly lose if we printed the stories. It was very uncharacteristic. And the author asked him if Fulbright and Jaworski had any conflicts of interest with their story. He immediately said, no, none that I know of. He also added that Fulbright and Jaworski had represented M-Bank at one time, but that bank had been purchased and no longer in existence. That was all he said. But his reaction to Mitchner material, along with Wallingford's behavior, was enough to scare the Post editors away from running any substantial story on Mitchner in the beginning of the expose, when they should have been ran. By the end of summer of 1990, we had printed all of the stories that had initially been written about the CIA and savings and loan, except for the ones about Mitchner. I then turned to our editor and reapproached this angle. This time, for some reason, Wallingford, the senior attorney, stayed out of it, but his associate, Godbold, despite additional information and cooperation, continued to object. Finally, in the summer of 90, we had a big meeting with Godbold and the top editors of the paper, in which the editors led me to believe that I had answered all of his objections. We had a new editorial editor-in-chief, Charles Cooper, who had taken over from Burgeon. Cooper told Tim Graham and me after the meeting that he was committed to printing the stories. Graham had been promoted to city editor, and he was completely in favor of printing them too. It was Christmas time, and the author was on vacation. The stories were scheduled to run December 31st. Graham called me from the city desk saying that Godbold would not sign off on them, but he was approving them anyway and would so recommend to Cooper. In the end, Cooper, the new editor, decided not to run them. based on the fact that the law firm refused to sign off. The author was furious and told Graham that Godbold's job was probably on the line, and if Godbold could stop the Michener stories, he probably wouldn't be made a partner at Fulbright and Jaworski. I then began a leave of absence to work on this book. After 6 weeks, I was having lunch with Graham, the executive editor Ernie Williamson. Guess what? Graham said. Godbold just was made partner. That's when I began looking in earnest of what conflicts of interest Fulbright and Jaworski had in the savings and loan stories. As previously mentioned, Fulbright and Jaworski allegedly laundered money for the CIA through MD Anderson Foundation. The Washington office of Fulbright and Jaworski had represented Herman Beebe's financed CIA-connected Palmer National Bank in Washington, D.C., that Stefan Halper had set up. Graham said that Wallingford objected strongly to running our stories on Palmer National Bank and wanted to have a sit-down meeting about it. The CIA front bank of Stefan Halper, funded by Mafia Herman Beebe. The Washington office of Fulbright and Jaworski was a client of William Casey when he was in private practice before heading to the CIA. Fulbright and Jaworski helped handle a real estate deal in the mid-70s for Herman Beebe, Richard Rossmiller, and Surety Savings. Fulbright and Jaworski represented the campaign of County Judge John Lindsay in an effort to retrieve some interest earned on deposits at the FDIC. Fulbright and Jaworski had represented one of Howard Pulver's companies in a lawsuit. Wallingford had strenuously objected to the Houston Post running the story about Pulver and Martin Schrimmer being neighbors, which contained a great deal of background about Pulver. Wallingford succeeded in keeping a lot of the detail out of the article. And finally, there were the conflicts involving Michener. First, Wallingford is good friends and a golf partner with Michener's personal attorney and close friend Tom Alexander. Every time I would press Wallingford about running the Michener stories, he would say something like, "Wait until I retire. You know we can't run that." He would try to make a joke about it and blow it off. At the same time that Fulbright and Jaworski was telling us we couldn't run the Michener stories, it was representing Michener Corp. In court in a wrongful death lawsuit against Michener's company. After I told Graham that I had discovered this, he questioned Godbold about it. The new Fulbright and Jaworski partner told Graham that he hadn't known about the suit and that Fulbright and Jaworski was brought in by Michener's insurance company, Aetna. First, ignorance is not an excuse. Godbold, who had a duty to conduct a conflict of interest check, apparently was ethically laxed and did not investigate whether the law firm had any conflicts of interest with Michener, even after I specifically asked them if they had any. And that's giving him the benefit of the doubt that he actually didn't know of all of the conflicts of interest. Second, the fact that Aetna was Fulbright and Jaworski's client and had hired the law firm to represent Michener's corporation makes no difference. Michener's company is Fulbright and Jaworski's client in the wrongful death suit, and the law firm therefore owes it its full loyalty. At the same time, Fulbright and Jaworski was representing the Houston Post in advising us about a story on one of their clients without revealing it. Also, this was not the first lawsuit in which Fulbright and Jaworski had represented Michener's company. In 1979, Michener Corporation was involved in a suit regarding the garnishment of workers' wages. Fulbright and Jaworski was hired to represent Michener. And a call to Fulbright and Jaworski with the request to speak to an attorney handling Walter Michener's interests is referred to an attorney in the firm's San Antonio office. A secretary in that office said the attorney there coordinates litigation through other law firms for Michener Enterprises, an affiliate of Michener's umbrella company. One of Michener's trademark tricks is hiring as many law firms as he can so that whoever's fighting him will have a conflict of interest. There is little question that Fulbright and Jaworski had a conflict of interest between Walter Michener and the Houston Post. In addition, they had a duty to determine whether there was a conflict, and further duty to report it to the Post. The Texas disciplinary rules of professional conduct for lawyers state that in the event of such a conflict, the law firm is required to disclose the existent nature, implications, and possible adverse consequences of the common representation. There is something else just as troubling about the Michener lawsuits. Texas disciplinary rules also state that a law firm should not represent a person, in this case, the Houston Post, if such representation reasonably appears to be adversely limited by the law firm's own interest. Fulbright and Jaworski intersects with Michener's circle and nexus of friends repeatedly. A good many of Fulbright and Jaworski's clients have some sort of connection to Michener, either business-wise or personal, and the law firm probably wouldn't mind representing Michener in the future. So if it allowed anything adverse to Michener to be printed, it would be bad for their business. But such a situation should not have been surprising to the editors of the Post. They should never have used the giant Fulbright and Jaworski as lawyers during the savings and loan stories in the first place. After I had told the Post editors about the conflicts I had discovered during my leave of absence, they still continued to use Fulbright and Jaworski. They continued representation was one of the reasons I didn't go back to work at the Post after I finished this book. And it is one of the reasons I decided to go to law school. I was determined that no lawyer or law firm would ever be able to tell me what I could print and what I couldn't. I did manage to get Michener's name in one of the stories during the summer of '90, which by some omission was not sent over to Fulbright and Jaworski. Reacted immediately. He hired the famous Houston plaintiff attorney, Joe Jamel, and self-proclaimed king of torts, and threatened to sue us. Michener also simultaneously tried a different tact and began to get closer to the Houston Post publisher, Dean Singleton. They apparently became friends, I was told. When Dave Burgeon left to go to San Francisco in the winter of '90, Singleton threw him a party. As Singleton walked past me, he told me that I was getting him in trouble with his friends. I asked him which friends he was talking about, and he said Larry Meisel. He further stated that Meisel, the Denver home builder, who was in hot water with his dealings in Silverado Savings and some other dirty savings and loans, was a very good friend of his. Singleton's company also owned the Denver Post. So I figured that was how he had met Meisel. But I asked him anyhow how he had first made his acquaintance. He replied that Michael Milkins had introduced them. It was a miracle that any investigative reporting on the savings and loan scandal got published in the Houston Post at all. During the summer of '90, in the middle of the stories on the CIA SNL connection in the Post, the author was contacted by the editor of the New York publishing house, Simon & Schuster. He told me his father had seen the write-up of his stories, and he asked me to send him copies of the stories. After I sent him the stories, he called me to say Simon & Schuster wanted me to fly to New York to talk with their editors about putting them in a book. He met with Charles Hayward, the president of Simon & Schuster's massive trade division, who had since moved to Little Brown, a couple of other editors, and Alice Mayhew, the company's most renowned editor. I remember the meetings as being very pleasant. I particularly liked Alice. She had edited all the President's Men for Bob Woodward. I flew back to Houston, and the next day Alice called with an offer. She said Simon & Schuster would pay me $100,000 advance and that she could get me a good contract. Several days later, I received the contract from Simon & Schuster in the mail. Reading it was like being slapped in the face with a bucket of ice water. It was a sucker's contract. The most disappointing aspect of it was that the payout of $100,000 advance was not anything like what Alice had promised. The terms were significantly more favorable to the publisher. When I pointed out that the advance payout was much different from what Alice had originally promised, they immediately changed it back. But the episode had left a bad taste in my mouth. During the contract negotiations, I also brought up the fact that it was imperative that the book be published before the 1992 presidential election. At that point in time, it appeared likely that George Bush would again be the Republican nominee and therefore had a chance. And it appeared that Lloyd Bentsen was going to be on the Democrat candidate side. And both people played a role in the book. Because of my request, Simon & Schuster modified the contract and agreed to get the book out within 12 months rather than their normal 18 months. The book took longer to write than I expected, and Alice accurately predicted, but I submitted it on the deadline date anyway. 2 months later, in September, I received a 4-page editing letter from Alice and her associate editors to whom she had delegated the manuscript. You've got fascinating and important material. The sheer volume of your evidence is impressive, blah, blah, blah. The letter then stated that the structure of the book was difficult to discern and suggested an alternative organization in terms of layers that distance both the CIA and the mafia and the savings and loan scandal. Perhaps, the letter said, the final section would take aim at all the government officials and bureaucrat red tape that shut all the doors. Keating and his group, Bentsen, Gates, Conley, Justice Department, CIA, and of course, George Bush. Clearly, this layer is the most protected. I wrote Alice and her associates a letter back criticizing some of their comments and suggesting a different kind of organization around the layers of protection insulation for those in the scandal. They in turn replied, "We are both a little perplexed, but largely encouraged by your memo. We think all of us are in a basic agreement. We did not want to suggest that you invent a rip-snorting yarn. You have very compelling material, damning in its own right, but you do need urgently to give the reader more guidance, enough to get his bearings and keep him on the central track. In fact, we do think you accomplished much of what you set out to do, tracing the lineage back to the mafia and CIA, but you do it uneconomically." After several months of trying to restructure the book along the lines suggested, I gave up. It just wasn't working. I then began a new presentation along the lines of how I uncovered the stories. This worked better. It took me another 3 months to finish it. By this time, we are in February of 92. During that period, I kept them all updated on my progress. After I submitted the newly restructured manuscript in February of 92, I waited to hear nothing. Finally, several weeks later, I called the associate editors to check on the status. He brushed me off. He said he hadn't even read the revised version. I realized that Simon & Schuster's attitude towards that book had changed for the worse. Also, around the time I learned the publishers put out in the spring what they call their fall list, a list of books that they planned to publish, and his book was not on the list. I started calling Alice directly rather than working through her assistants. I sent her letters, faxes to remind her that the book had to be printed in the fall. I received nothing. At last, I called her secretary and made an appointment to go to New York. 2 days before the meeting, Alex faxed me a message saying that she had to postpone it. It was only then that she returned my phone call. She informed me that the fall list was already closed and it was impossible to publish the book. Of course it was. It certainly seemed that Simon & Schuster had deliberately delayed replying to my communications to delay the book and keep it out of the bookstores before the election. Other writers I knew who were familiar with Simon & Schuster and Alex Mayhew said that it could be that Alice didn't like the book. During their discussion, she said 2 things to me that indicated there was more to it. In trying to justify not publishing it before the election, she said, quote, "Nobody reads anything in September and October," unquote. That struck me as nonsense, and I wondered if she ever told that to the other authors whose books she was printing in the fall during September and October. Then, when I pointed out to Alice that the American people needs and deserves to know before the election the facts about George Bush and his circle of friends, she replied to him, Bush is going to win anyway. Granted, this was before the Democrat nominee had been decided, but that right doesn't belong to an editor that owes the truth to the American people. Perhaps Alice truly believed that Bush would really win, but there are several relationships that are worth noting that may have explained Simon and Schuster's behavior. One of George Bush's closest friends, with whom he started Zapata Petroleum back in 1950, is Hugh Leedick, the chairman of Pennzoil. Leedick is mentioned in this book in connection to a Houston bank. He is also a member of the board of directors of Paramount Communications, the parent of Simon & Schuster. Paramount Communication is the successor company to the giant Gulf Western. One of Gulf Western's original founders was Houston businessman John Duncan. John Duncan and his brother Charles, the former Secretary of Energy, and before that, the Deputy Secretary of Defense in the Carter administration, were involved in the family business Duncan Coffee, which was merged with Coca-Cola. Holy shit. Charles subsequently became president of Coca-Cola, which of course they were implicated in business with Walter Mitchner in buying the Belize landing area, 12% of the country, to smuggle arms and drugs. When Charles was nominated as Secretary of Energy, he was introduced to the Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources as Mitchner's good friend, by Mitchner's good friend, Senator Lloyd Bentsen. And John and Charles are involved in a number of investments and business ventures with Mitchner's close associate, Jack Trotter, and Trotter's wife. Trotter is the named partner in the DC lobbyist and law firm McClure and Trotter, who boast client and biggest client is Coca-Cola. Such relationships doesn't necessarily prove a conspiracy, but they do show the pervasiveness of the influence of a small circle of Texas businessmen. And that pretty much does it. That's freaking crazy. So we will do another short show to go through the epilogue because he had some facts that I think bears witness, but we're right at an hour, so I'm going to close it. But we'll start that on our next show. Illini, go ahead.
Wow, Colonel. I mean, I think my biggest complaint about the Pete Bruton books isn't the quality of the journalism. It's the fact that there's 100 or so names and like 50 or so entities in each chapter. But
yes,
I'm going to try to go through at least a couple of the names that got mentioned here. Number one, of course, was Robert Maxwell.
Yep.
For those who don't know, he was a British publisher who was very friendly with Israel. He was, I think, involved with the abduction of Mordecai Beninu, which was a Mossad operation in the late 1980s. And of course, Ari Ben Menashe was the Mossad agent who gave a lot of these disclosures
yes,
to everyone. So what's the significance? Of course, Robert Maxwell was the father of Elaine Maxwell.
Yep.
Who gets covered extensively in Whitney Webb's book. But okay, so I forget the exact connection again because again, like 150 different proper nouns in this book and all these different connections crossing. I recall he had a connection though to a specific savings and loan entity that was associated with the Bush family, and that is where you can start to bring in the Franklin scandal, as well as, I think crucially, it was Paul Bonacci's testimony to Ted Gunderson in 1992, where he said rather specifically mid-'80s, when Bush was the vice president, he was at a party at Craig Spence's house, where they were upstairs, and George H.W. Bush Sr. Was involved with the boy in one of the upstairs rooms. I think that was that's about an hour or so into his testimony.
Yeah.
To understand, if I recall correctly. But Paul Bonacci comes out and says it. The Franklin scandal, of course, was this really, it needs to be viewed as this connection between the Franklin Credit Union of Omaha, Nebraska, Boys Town, and Craig Spence, where children under the age of 18 were being ferried on these private jet flights without their parents out to Washington, D.C. And they have the, if I recall correctly, they have the Gary Caradori was able to obtain the passenger manifests, and then, received testimony from these children about, sex between, high-ranking individuals and, these underage children. Another part that John DeCamp raised in his 1994 book on all of this, of course, was the Denver connection, where these kids were also taken to Denver, and there was a lot of speculation about, Neil Bush and his credit union, his savings and loan organization out there. John DeCamp, I don't think I remember them having anything hard or specific or detailed on it, but there was this connection to the city of Denver and speculation about, the Bush family.
And the connection was by Robert Maxwell was the potential purchase of Bluebonnet Savings and Loan, connected to Republican Senator John Tower. They were wanting to buy that out of the foreclosure stuff. So,
I mean, you almost need an LLM. I think you need to stick the whole thing into ChatGPT and ask it to basically construct the network for you.
Yes.
And then even there, you need, I don't think human beings can perceive in quite enough dimensions to really
That's true.
The graph that needs to be drawn here.
And the takeaway for all of it is that, just as Pete Bruton said, it is a network of people. And while you don't have to, because this isn't going to be a daily conversation you have, you come away from this book understanding that all of these things that are presented to us as Americans as isolated things. Oh, the CIA was running drugs. Oh, the CIA was involved in weapons. Oh, the savings and loan failed. Oh, this, congressional testimony happened. Oh, the Charles Keating thing. They're all presented to us as independent entities and then swept under the rug, when in fact, he does the best job of any book that I've read to date of showing you there is an undercurrent of all of these seemingly independent things happening in America that all go back to the exact same connected people. And these people are all connected to the CIA and the mafia. And he did an excellent job of doing that.
Travis just added me, and he mentioned that.
I'm sorry, you cut out, Illini. Bridget, will you take him down and bring him back up, please? Oh,
yep, no problem.
Yeah. Okay, SR, go ahead.
Everybody saw the reference to his post.
SR, go ahead. I'll come back to Illini in a minute.
Thank you, Colonel, and thank everyone for attending here in Spaces and on Rumble. Another excellent book. Outstanding. Couple of things that I was looking at here. Bluebonnet Savings Bank. For those that don't know, the bluebonnet is a Texas state flower. Lady Bird Johnson was the one that put bluebonnets all along the highways. So there's a little bit of background of what's going on here. But what I found most interesting concerning Bluebonnet sued the government in 91 for breach of contract. That cost us, the taxpayer, over $1 billion in settlements among all the affected thrifts by 2000. 2000 cost us over $1 billion. The other thing was Walter Mischer. He was never charged with anything.
No.
He got away scot-free.
He's CIA.
Not one bit of litigation against that man.
He's CIA. He's untouchable.
Thank you, Colonel.
Sure. Illini, the last part of what you said cut out, so we couldn't hear you.
We should really bring Travis Wagner up to the stage to explain this better than I'll be able to. But he added me in a comment, and he wants to. It seems like he's mentioning that Robert Maxwell had some connections to MI6 as well, and he was also part of the CIA and connected to Alan Dulles.
So he most certainly had connections to Mossad. He was selling the promised software for Mossad. So there's Whitney Webb's book makes that crystal clear. He was working hand in hand with Mossad. His two twin daughters also were working with the IDF in development of software and Mossad. That entire family is connected to the intelligence apparatus of the Israeli government. Unquestionable.
Wait, Colonel, when you say twin daughters, are you referring to Elaine?
No.
Or is that somebody else?
No,
Okay.
there's four of them. There's twin daughters that reside out in Silicon Valley intimately. That's all covered in Whitney Webb's book. They're in all kinds of nefarious software that oftentimes are linked to the IDF and Mossad. And Whitney Webb makes all of those connections. If anybody is interested, go on to Mint Press. She's written article after article, and they're in her 2 volumes of books that we have covered over on Rumble as well. It's a family affair. I'll just leave it at that. All right. Anybody else? Okay.
I did find one more thing kind of funny, though.
Okay.
And that was Bluebonnet Savings Bank. This was James Fail. So,
okay.
yes, they found a patsy.
Yeah, they always do. And just for the record, I lived in Texas for 2 years, and I do love the fact that there's field after field after field of bluebonnets everywhere in Texas. It is the most beautiful time in the hill country of Texas to drive through there when the bluebonnets are blooming. Not a fan of ladybirds, but it is a beautiful sight. Okay. That's it. You guys have a nice weekend. And just so that you guys know, tomorrow I am recording 2 different shows that I will post, and I will let you guys know when I post them. And the reason why I'm recording them is because the 2 individuals that I'm interviewing are not accustomed to appearing on camera. One of them is a neighbor of mine, Olivia Pollock. She is a January 6er. And the other person that I'm interviewing, I'm going to do one interview with both of them and let them tell you collectively their January 6th story. And then I'm going to interview her fiance, who not only was a fellow January 6er, but he is a Army guy that has extensive experience, and I'm going to kind of walk him through Operation Gladio, and we're going to have a discussion about that. And so if they want to edit any part of it, I'm going to give them that prerogative to do that. So I just, because they're new to this whole business, I want to give them that opportunity. So I'm going to close with this. I want to share with you guys, because I told you all of this is a team. You guys are my team, and I am sharing it with my team. I got a response, and I'm going to bring it up, from our Emmer defender. And I want you guys to know what that is. Hold on just a second. My computer's acting stupid. Okay. So my response, I got a response from him. This is the responser. Happy New Year. I was Tom's legislative advisor, which I knew because I researched him before I responded. The context he was the African subcommittee of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. We had racial, ethnic issues we were trying to manage, which means absolutely nothing. Tom was always opposed to fraud and forced cultural displacement and wanted to protect the constituents in his district, which of course doesn't explain why he told them to shut up and called them racist, but whatever. But the reality was American citizens that happened to be Somali were moving to the district. We had several incidents and something needed to give. Mainly, we had people demanding we send in federal and local police and remove Somalis legally here. He's a freshman congressman, meaning at the time, who had nothing to do with these people coming to the United States 20 years before. Most of the people had been here since the 90s. The Somali caucus, which, if you don't know, was designed to inform members of Congress on the issues, was started to improve the security in Somalia so refugees go home and not need to come to the United States in the first place. It was also designed to raise awareness and end remittance and other fraud. Let's see. What else he said? Tom was getting political pressure from people that, while well-meaning, wanted to protect their town, were asking us to violate the Constitution and send law enforcement and remove people from their town simply based on race. That isn't why they were doing it. It had nothing to do with race. It had to do with fraud. Because at the time Tom Emmers was elected, the fraud had already been discovered, because he came in the 2015-16 timeframe, and this fraud was already identified in 2015, if not earlier than that. It had nothing to do with race. And then he goes on to say that's absolutely unconstitutional, as you know, and to move them to another city, not to port them from the U.S. That was the town hall. What else is he supposed to say? He has managed this issue better than anyone could have. Keith Ellison, not the ideal partner politically, but in Congress, he was very reasonable with other members. His office helped us to bridge gaps so that we could speak with authority on these issues to a new set of constituents that at that point refused to work with us. Tom has always opposed fraud and has never been in on some invasion to sell out his district. Literally 1,000% of the criticism falls on Walz. That's not true. And the federal government for decades for looking the other way. But I can tell you, Tom is fair and honest on the issue as he could be. Not trying to pull myself into this, but to imply Tom did something wrong is not close to right. Walz deserves all of the criticism. He is to blame for the mess today, not Tom. Which, of course, Tom has now been in Congress for almost 10 years. And I went and checked. I did a search on Yandex for him saying anything about pushing back on any of this, and I can't find it. So here's what I said back. Happy New Year to you as well. While I appreciate your explanation, it comes across to me as he had good intentions and as a result doesn't bear responsibility for the results. That has worked well for congressional members in the past, but given where we are today, it no longer works. As we descend into the pit of no return as a republic, one one we both swore an oath to defend because he's a former Marine. All of us need to research how we arrived at this point. I've been researching this for the past 3 years. It is quite clear to me how we got here. I'm constantly surprised by people like you with your access to so much information that I seem to have missed it. Surely you understand. This is so little. Excuse me for stumbling. Surely you understand that locations to resettle refugees are not random. They are managed by the State Department, state and local governments. The only people not consulted are the local populations. When those local populations realize what's going on, it's too late. Congress members like Emmer told his constituents that they were racist if they questioned it. Having grown up in Florida, I'm acutely aware of the process used because Florida has been a dumping ground for the failed CIA operations in Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, etc. This gave rise to narco trafficking networks those countries were conducting into Florida and the rest of the U.S. Local populations who spoke up were accused of being racist when objecting to the increase in violence, narcotics, and corruption. The Somali situation is no different. The local congressional members did exactly what Emmer did. They reach across the aisle and form an alliance in Congress that manages the foregone conclusion that always negatively impacts local communities they swore to represent. The correlation to CIA operations and destabilization, which generates the refugees, is ignored, accommodated, and the world moves on. The role of the State Department in this operation is also ignored. It continues without regard to Democrats or Republicans being in charge with the cooperation of, hold on, I don't know why this thing keeps, it's long, sorry. While the local Minnesota population may not have advocated for a proper response to the situation, legal options, the failure of their representation to find the actual root cause of what is happening and the accommodation of the operation is a failure. I understand your role in advising the congressman and your vested interest in protecting him, but it doesn't change the lasting effect in America. There has been no meaningful effort to stop any of this, including the massive funds leaving the U.S. The exposure years ago that a significant amount of the Somali funds were being invested in real estate, not in Somalia, but in Kenya, should have set off alarm bells. It did not. It too was swept under the rug. Congressional members have significant powers to expose wrongdoing and a responsibility to protect not only their constituents, but America. Very few have the courage to do that, because it doesn't allow upward movement in the respective parties. And in some cases, like Leo Ryan, results in their assassination. As a citizen and a military officer, I feel an obligation to share my research and advocate for meaningful change, not convenient short-term fixes that perpetuate a broken system. It's interesting that Emmer removed his announcement from his official website that he formed the Somali caucus, which, by the way, isn't a good look, especially if it was meant to address legitimate issues. He formed the caucus within a few months of taking office, while the population of Somalis in his district was still very small. It's understandable that the constituents were concerned that one of his first initiatives that he took in office was forming this caucus. We obviously have different objectives and solutions with regards to this issue, but I appreciate your explanation. End of story. So that was my response.
That response is stellar.
Thank you.
I mean, I know you were more than a limit writing it. You had to take your time with it. I'm sure you probably went through that
and deleted
120 times, if not more.
I didn't. I wrote it all. And all in one time. I didn't even change anything. I just wrote it. Did I want to put some additional words in there? Yes, I did. But the one thing, you guys get the raw uncut version of me. What you rarely see is the Colonel side of me in those situations. That was the Colonel talking, not Roxanne talking. So,
and that's one of the reasons why I absolutely love you.
Yeah. I don't reserve the Colonel conversations because I feel that the unvarnished truth is much more real to people. You would not have, I would have not ever made a Colonel if I talk like Roxanne talks. So I know the situations that warrant that, but that truly isn't who I am as a person. It's not that I'm not capable of articulating fluent thought in a meaningful way, but it is also not a natural state for me. It is something that I had to learn. It took a long time for me to learn that, and I had a lot of great mentors that taught me that skill. Because, you know, like you guys know, I grew up running around barefooted on a dirt road. My dad was a truck driver. That none of that came natural to me. But I'm a quick study. I learn things, and I'm a survivor. So you do what you got to do. And I did what I needed to do. And I knew the higher in rank I got, the more I had to curtail my natural instinct as far as the choice of words, but I felt it necessary because as a colonel, you can affect a whole lot more change for the good of the entire Air Force than you can as a captain or major. And I had made a commitment when I took my commission to better the environment that our enlisted personnel lived in. And that was my commitment to them. I started off as an enlisted person, and I definitely kept that throughout my entire career. It does require you to be much more colonelish when you're having conversations and you're imploring somebody who's much higher in rank than you to make the necessary changes. And I'm very happy with the things that I was able to do in my career along those lines. So, but thank you, SR. Anyway, that's it. That's enough. So I will discernment versus boldness ratio changes with rank. You're absolutely right, AP Jonas. You have to use discernment. And it's just a very interesting dynamic. It was very hard for me to do. It's not my natural state. I'll just say that. Anyway, you guys have a nice weekend. I will let you know when I post those interviews. And anyway, that's it. That's for the weekend. And hopefully I can get those out on Sunday. But if not, I'll just keep you posted. Take care, everybody. You guys have a nice weekend. See ya.